Good evening, and welcome to this Cary Lecture Series event tonight. We're very excited to have with us Jody Adams. Jody's a very well-known chef and restaurateur in Boston, and she's also an activist. We'll talk about that tonight with her. This evening's program is brought to you in partnership with Carey Library here in Lexington. My name is Maggie Pax, and I'm one of the all-volunteer committee members for the Cary Lecture Series. As many of you may know, the Cary Lecture Series has been supported by a bequest from two sisters, Susanna Carey and Eliza Carey Farnham, who in 1911 gave a bequest to honor their father, Isaac Harris Carey. The money they gave went for three purposes. One was to build Carey Hall, which you see in the picture here and which is behind me in my background. But their bequest also established the Isaac Carey Educational Fund. This Carey Fund, it finances college scholarships, and it also supports the Cary Lecture Series. The sisters wanted to bring to Lexington educational lectures every year. So we bring you 4 free educational lectures every year. Over the past years, we brought many great speakers to Lexington or to Zoom. Those have included Doris Kearns Goodwin, who's a really well-known presidential biographer and historian. Also television news anchor Gwen Ifill, Harvard historian and New Yorker writer Jill Lepore. And recently, we also brought Paul Farmer, who is an anthropologist and epidemiologist, among many other speakers that we've had over the years. Tonight is the second out of 4 of this year's Cary Lecture Series. I just want to let you know that in March, we will have a really great talk by two professors at Princeton, Annie Case and Sir Angus Deaton, who've written a really remarkable book called Deaths of Despair. And it's about the middle-aged deaths that occur related to economic inequality, social isolation, and feelings of hopelessness. And this deaths of despair have been estimated to be as much as 150,000 per year, a number that has actually brought down the overall US life expectancy. So we hope that you'll join us for that lecture, which we believe will be in Carey Memorial Hall in person. So tonight, we're happy to welcome Jody Adams. Jody Adams, as you might know, is the person who has formed, created, and run many restaurants in Boston. In fact, you may have eaten at some of her restaurants, or you may have eaten at all of her restaurants. She's a 2-time winner of the James Beard Award. In 1997, she won for Best Chef in the Northeast, and she also won subsequently another award from the James Beard Foundation. And she has built up from her early days a series of restaurants that she'll talk about to great success and a lot of acclaim. However, as you also know, the COVID pandemic has really hit the restaurant world extremely hard, and she joined with other restaurateurs to begin advocacy work to help support local eateries survive. She'll talk with us about those efforts tonight also. Jody's very active in a nonprofit focused on alleviating childhood hunger. It's called Share Our Strength. And I would just comment that Jody's husband is Ken Rivard, who's a professional photographer. So some of the pictures that we share tonight will be by her husband, Ken. So Jody, I'll just invite you to turn on your camera and we'll welcome you here before we go into some of the other slides. So welcome.
Hi everyone. I'm saying hello
people
from Dorchester. I know you guys are all over Massachusetts, maybe mostly in Lexington, but hello.
Well, welcome. And I love that you're between the ferns, which is great.
Yes, I'm between 2 ferns.
Good. I'm in Carey Memorial Hall, which is where we would be in normal times. So I want to ask you first to just talk a little bit about your early life. And I'm going to go with the photograph here. that is of you at some age, pretty early. I'm just really curious about this picture and about how you got started getting interested in food and in restaurants.
So that's a picture of Barnstable Harbor, and I'm holding the first fish that I ever caught. It's probably a striped bass. I don't know, 10 maybe or 11. And my father would have taken me fishing. I spent my summers in Barnstable, and it's really where I learned about eating directly from the sea, from the ground. My father fished every weekend when he was there, and he would gut the fish right about where I'm standing and grill it outside. We dug for clams, we dug for razor clams, we picked mussels, and there were local farms. So certainly it was a place and a time that I began to understand that when you ate something in a particular place and it came from a particular environment, it had a specific flavor. And the flavor had to do with not just what you were tasting, but where you were, how you felt. And the picture earlier of me enthusiastically flipping burgers is also a view of Barnstable Harbor many years later. And those were not caught. Those burgers were not caught from the harbor. But and I love that picture because I'm cooking everyday food. I was actually cooking with my sister, who isn't in that particular picture, and I'm cooking for a huge crowd, and just doing what everybody does in the summer. So that was Labor Day.
So how did you get from this picture to running all these restaurants? I mean, your early life, you were interested in food because your family was getting food right from the ocean.
And
then
we also,
yeah, go ahead.
Sorry to interrupt, but my father was a rare book librarian, and at Brown University, the John Carter Brown Library, my mother was a librarian at the Whaling Museum. He was eligible for sabbaticals. So we spent 2 different years living in England, but traveling in Europe. And it was that travel that really then opened me up to the experience of eating food from farmers markets, food in France, food in Italy and Spain and Switzerland. Even in Morocco, as a teenager at the age of 14, I spent a month in Morocco and learned how to make couscous and tagines and go to the market. And later on, I spent a summer in Guatemala. My father's brother was a Latin American anthropologist and had married a woman from Guatemala. So I spent a summer in Guatemala and learned how to make tortillas and refried beans. And I always gravitated to the kitchen. And in our family, the dinner table was the center of the day. It was where we gathered every evening to catch up. We had no television growing up, so we had to entertain ourselves in various ways. And that included a lot of books, a lot of music, a lot of conversation, and a lot of food.
Sounds magical. So if we fast forward a little bit, then we come to really kind of this glamour shot of you. I don't know what age you were at, right behind like the queen of cooking, Julia Child, surrounded by a lot of other people who look like they're in the restaurant business. What's going on here, and how do you get from this sort of idyllic childhood pulling fish from the sea to being in the center of this community of chefs?
Yeah, I love that picture. That's a great picture. I was I know I was in my early 30s. That's a picture. If people know Boston chefs, there's Julia. There is, to her right, Deborah Hughes from Upstairs on the Square. Behind her is Anna Sortun. Mary Catherine. To the left of Mary Catherine is Jasper White. And I think Jimmy Burke is there. And Peter Davis from Henrietta's Table. So it definitely was a great group of people. I grew up in Providence, as we have said, and I grew up a few streets away from a woman, Nancy Verity Barr. Nancy Verity Barr had gone to cooking school with Madeline Kamen and was teaching out of her house. I became her assistant. I started by washing dishes, and I would arrive to a pile of dishes, and I asked if I could avoid the pile of dishes and actually get there earlier and do the dishes as they were created. So I learned a lot just from being there. And later on, Nancy was asked to be the executive chef for an event for Julia. Julia was doing a fundraiser at Planned Parenthood at RISD, Rhode Island School of Design. And again, I washed dishes there for this event. She was incredibly gracious. I was in awe. And then many years later, I re-met with her, and she told me I had worked for a catering company. I'd worked for a gourmet food store. I had worked in a cafe. I had graduated from Brown University with a degree in anthropology. I thought I was going to become a nurse practitioner. I learned very quickly that that was not the right path for me. I had this history and this experience of cooking. And I found myself working behind a counter in a gourmet food store, and I felt like I had arrived at home, that was where I belonged. I spent a summer doing that. And Julia came into the store with Nancy Verity Barr, and we talked about, she wanted to know how I was doing. And I told her that I really wanted to work in a restaurant. I didn't know what that meant. I'd never been in a restaurant. And remember, this is in the early 80s. People like me did not have experience really in restaurants unless you were, a waitress. I had never even been a waitress. We don't even say waitresses anymore, but anyway. But I knew I wanted to work in a restaurant. And she said, you must go to Boston and you must work for Lydia Shire. And I went to Boston. I sent out a resume, and I went to Boston, and I knocked on doors, and I talked to a variety of chefs and restaurateurs. I was told by one chef I was too old. At that point, I was like 25 years old. He said, I'm not going to pay you anything. You couldn't live on what I pay you. You'd have to live with your parents. And so you're too old to come to work for me. I was told that by another chef, an old French chef, that he wouldn't hire me to work anywhere but pastry because I wouldn't have the stamina to do it. And I just held out, and I went to talk to Lydia, and she wasn't there. She was in France, actually. She was eating foie gras in France, having a wonderful travel trip. But I did talk to Gordon Hammersley, who was the sous chef, and he wouldn't hire me because I didn't have enough experience, because I'd never worked in a restaurant. So I was really stuck. And I was just kind of hanging out and waiting. And 2 weeks later, he called me. I remember I was on a ladder painting my apartment. And he said that the woman who had taken the position that I had wanted was not really working out, and would I like to come and work for them at Seasons in the Bostonian Hotel. And without like skipping a beat, I said, yes. I had, I didn't even think, well, maybe I should play hard to get, I said, yes, absolutely. When? I'll start right now. Just have to wipe the paint off my hands. So I was hired by Gordon and Lydia, and that was the start. And I had never worked in a restaurant. If any of you have ever worked in a restaurant, you know that working on a line is usually you work up to that, but I was thrown in the middle of the line. And I cried and I cut myself and I burned myself and I made a huge mess every day. And eventually I figured out how to streamline my work. I put my head down and I just was determined to be the best that I could be. And that picture of me with Julia is when I was the chef at Michaela's. I had made my way cooking at Seasons for, I think it was 4 years with Lydia and Gordon. And when Gordon left to open Hammersley's Bistro in the South End, he asked if I would be his sous chef. I was there for 3 years. It was an amazing experience. Both experiences were amazing. After about 3 years, he turned to me and said, "It's time for you to move on."
You need a new
I think
experience.
Excuse me?
You need a new experience.
Well, I think I was getting too bossy. I mean, I was really, you're not allowed to say bossy anymore either, but I think I was just getting really controlling. And Michaela Larson was looking for a chef. And so I applied for that position and I got it. And it was, again, way over my head, way, way, way over my head. I went from being the sous chef of a 50-seat restaurant, Hammersley's Bistro, the first Hammersley's Bistro, to Michaela's that had, and it was dinner only, to Michaela's that had lunch and dinner, not only dinner in the dining room, but dinner in the cafe, a takeout shop, catering, offsite catering. It was an enormous project.
Yes,
And
you won a Food and Wine Award for your work at Michaela,
yes,
right?
I did.
I think it worked out okay.
It did work out okay. So anyway, that's how I ended up there with Julia. And
Right. And then from there,
able to call her my friend. Yeah.
I was going to say from there, okay, so dishwashing, knocking on doors, earning, paying your dues, earning your stripes, and then, I mean, entrepreneur, right? So you moved to being whatever they call it today, a serial entrepreneur with multiple restaurants. And what's interesting, I mean, there's a lot of things that's interesting about these restaurants. Rialto had a very long run. 22 years for a restaurant is several lifetimes, right? Considering how hard it is to make it in the restaurant business. And that restaurant is quite different from the ones you have now. So can you tell us a little bit about how it was to transition from being a chef to being an entrepreneur and a chef? I mean, was that natural or was it completely different skill set that you had to take on?
It was a different skill set for sure. Although I will tell you that when I was the chef at Rialto, I was asked once to speak at Brown on an entrepreneurial panel. And it was before the first 13 years I was the chef and partner at Rialto. The last 9 years, I was the chef and owner. So my role changed. And I was speaking and I said, I don't really know why I'm on this panel because I don't believe I'm an entrepreneur. I'm just a chef. And I almost had my hand slapped by the guy who started Nantucket Nectars. And he said, you are an entrepreneur. Every day that you create a menu, you're an entrepreneur. And it was such a lovely thing for him to say. So then I thought of myself as an entrepreneur. I started there. I was partners with Michaela Larson and a few other people. And I would just created this incredible restaurant with her and my partner, the other partners, that became a place that people thought of I heard of it as a hearth, as a living room, as my dining room, as a gathering place. It was just such a center in Cambridge. And I didn't really know that we were creating that because I was in the kitchen. It wasn't really until I started coming out of the kitchen and got to know customers that I realized that they actually always knew who I was. I just didn't know who they were.
Well, it was quite a hearth. I mean, this isn't like home cooking necessarily. I mean, the food that was served there was amazing. Things like brain and kidneys, and I mean, not only, but there were some pretty amazing dishes there. And I think it was a special place where people went for a special event, although maybe there were regulars who Went there all the
Oh,
time.
there were definitely regulars, and it served the Harvard community and the Kennedy School as well. There were people that we saw every week.
Yeah.
Particularly also in the bar and stuff. So we opened in 1994. That was in the years when all restaurants that were considered reviewable really had white tablecloths. They were all fine dining, fancy restaurants. And it was the only kind of restaurant that I wanted to work in at the time. And I was able to do incredible things in terms of, the cuisine that I served and the ingredients that I used. And nobody eats sweetbreads. Nobody eats brains anymore. It's hard to get anybody to eat liver, Rabbit is a stretch, and squab, whereas those were like everyday kinds of things were on menus when I started.
So has it changed to the point where you couldn't open a Rialto these days? You'd not find an audience for it?
I think it would be hard. I think you can, and I think there are in New York, and I think there are around the world. But Boston is there aren't restaurants like that. I think even Menton is changing now. So, it's funny because I have this image of an experience I had speaking a couple of years ago after a really rough day and realizing that I was making meatballs, and every restaurant that I had served meatballs. And I never served meatballs at Rialto. God forbid that I would serve meatballs at Rialto. That's a huge difference. But meatballs are great, and people love meatballs, and it's one of the top sellers in all the restaurants. So why not make great meatballs?
Yeah. So I'm just going to pause for a minute to say, I know we have a lot of people on the Zoom who will have questions, and we are going to go to questions in maybe 10 or 15 minutes. So if you have a question, you can feel free to just populate that Q&A, and then I'll be taking a look at that after we finish kind of going through some of these great pictures.
So let me just talk about the different restaurants, because you did ask the question and I tend to go down these rabbit holes. Rialto was for 22 years this amazing restaurant. I thought it could have kept going. We did need to reinvent it. I would have stripped the tablecloths off and changed it. It would have made many of my customers unhappy because they loved the experience of going. It was Marianne Thompson had redesigned it. It was quiet. It was, it felt like an embrace. It was a beautiful place. When we opened which we opened 10 years ago, I opened with young partners. They were in their 30s. I was not dying to open a restaurant. I had worked with one of them, and they wanted to open this incredible restaurant on this incredible site. And it was loud and boisterous, and I could, you couldn't hear yourself think, but it was so busy and so fast paced, and there were no tablecloths. It was a huge success. We now have we just reopened about 2 months ago. My partner, who is 10 years older, is very concerned about the sound. So there's a lot of, sound attenuation. We have a lot of fabric. You can hear yourself think. It's quite a different experience than it was. It has the same bones. And it is a Greek-inspired Mediterranean restaurant. Porto, we opened about 5 years ago. In Back Bay. It has an incredible patio, and it's the restaurant that was able to thrive during COVID because of the patio, and our landlords allowed us to double the size. So, and it's a beautiful Italian-inspired menu with Amaryllis is the chef there, and Alyssa, who's been with us for 10 years, is the general manager and managing partner. At just about the same time we opened Porto 5 years ago, we opened the first Saloniki, which is a Greek fast casual. And that was, again, opened with the same partners. We wanted to bring delicious Greek food, fresh, made by hand, inspired, recognizing that it would not be exactly the kind of food that you would have in Greece, but it would have the same flavors and same sauces, and it would just have a few twists to it. And we opened the first one, as I said, 5 years ago near Fenway, and we now have 3 and probably will have between 5 and 6 by the end of 2022.
Great. So this is a pretty broad range from Rialto, white tablecloths, sophisticated food, homey and welcoming, but at a high level, to the range that you've been able to open now.
But these are considered, Porto and Trade are now considered fine dining restaurants, even though they don't have tablecloths, even though the model is a lot of shared small plates at the beginning of a meal. It's a very different style, but this is what's considered fine dining now.
Yeah, the world has changed and you've changed with it. Yeah. So I'm going to actually skip over this wonderful slide about the awards and the book, only because we have to come up to some of the other things that we want to talk about before we do Q&A. And one of them is just how you've not only been focused in Boston, but have really had tremendous outreach in other parts of the world, probably affected by your early years growing up when you had exposure to overseas. But I know these are pictures from Haiti, Tanzania. Can you tell us about how you got involved with cooking outside of Boston?
Sure. Well, the picture of me with Paul Farmer is actually in Rwanda. And when I reopened Rialto in 2007, I decided to be extremely intentional about how I used my philanthropic time, because restaurateurs are asked to contribute to every organization, donate to every organization. And it had gotten to a point where it was out of my control. And I really wanted to use my value in a very intentional way, so it had exponential power. So I chose a local, a national, and an international organization to be really the ones I focused on. The Greater Boston Food Bank here in Boston addresses food insecurity, Share Our Strength, which is a national organization. It's the largest childhood hunger organization, and Partners in Health, because of the amazing work that they do that addresses hunger, because they address the needs of the poorest of the poor as a healthcare organization. And I had helped Partners in Health raise a significant amount of money by doing their first big fundraisers were at Rialto. They had never done big fundraisers before, and they did big fundraisers, and they raised several $1 million over the course of a couple of years. And so I was asked to be on the board and invited to go to Rwanda. So that was my first trip to Rwanda. I since returned about 2 years ago and worked with a team at the University of Global Health that had been built since I was there. It was in partnership with the hospital that was built. That was in Butero in Rwanda. The picture on the left is in Haiti, in a place called Zamni Bene, which is a housing or a home for children who were left behind after the earthquake of 2012. 2010. And this is their kitchen in Haiti, yes. And that was with Partners in Health. So I go to Haiti as a trustee member of the board and teach in the kitchens in the hospitals, and in that case, it's not an orphanage. You're not allowed to call it an orphanage. It's Zamni Bene, it's a home. The picture of Tanzania is in one of the camps in the Serengeti, and that experience resulted from talking to my friends Rick and Judy Wyland Thompson, who have the company Thompson Safari, because I have led numerous bike trips, culinary bike trips over the years. And I had talked to them about these culinary bike trips, and they said, why don't you do something with us in Tanzania? And I said, a bike trip on a safari? And so they said, no, well, no, you can't actually ride your bike in the Serengeti, but we could do something like that. So I've been on 4 different trips to Tanzania, leading groups, and then working with the culinary teams at the camps, and also doing some demonstrations for the guests who attend. And in all of my experiences here, of course, although I am teaching, I am learning, and I learned so much from all of these people. And my, in the world of the kitchen, the language is in your hands. I mean, you can see that the focus in these 2 kitchen pictures are on our hands. What's in our hands? What are our hands doing? So you don't really need a verbal language.
But very much.
I don't speak Haitian Creole. I don't speak Kenya Rwandan, and I don't speak whatever it is they speak.
Tanzania. Well, I mean, part of it is a humility, right? And going over and working with people, learning from them and teaching them at the same time. So it sounds like a remarkable decision to give back in that way, which is really an impressive.
Yeah, I mean, I'm gonna challenge you, Maggie. And I hope I don't embarrass you, but it's really it's an exchange more than anything else, and that's the way I view it, as an exchange.
That makes sense. That makes sense. So I do want to talk about COVID, because even though it's not a happy chapter for restaurants, it's incredibly important. And I think everybody who's on this call knows what happened to restaurants, or has a sense of it, maybe not the same sense that you have as someone running restaurants, but just the shuttered doors, the permanently closed temporarily, laying people off. I mean, it's been an incredibly hard time. Tell me about what the experience has been like for you as a restaurateur, and how you've joined with others in this period.
Thanks for asking about that. Yeah, I think that people know it was tough. On March 15th of 2020, we were told we had to close the doors of our restaurants, all of them. And there was nothing on the other side of that. Nobody had told us what happened next. And we were told that eventually that we could open, but we could only open for takeout. And we had to work in a particular kind of way. If everybody remembers, at that time, we thought that COVID lived on surfaces, that it lived on stainless steel surfaces. Well, restaurants are filled with stainless steel surfaces, and that you had to change your clothes coming in and change your clothes going out. We had these amazing protocols set in place, with gloves, hand washing, sanitizing, wiping stations down in our restaurants. But even before we reopened, what happened was restaurateurs across the country, locally and nationally, called each other and said, what the fuck are we gonna do? What the hell are we gonna do? And we started talking. And there were a group of us, 6 of us, who talked 3 times a week. And we learned about protocol. We learned about where to get masks. And that was before masks, actually. But then we had to have masks. And in order to open, we had to do certain kinds of things. And we had to have, worry about airflow and all kinds of things. So we joined forces as a group, and eventually said, we need need to make this real, and we coined our name, Massachusetts Restaurants United. We were able to, working with the Massachusetts Restaurant Association, and a lot of other organizations, to get caps on delivery fees, to extend patio, the patio extension. So as you all know, particularly last summer, you saw the streets were filled with patios. That was the work that we did to advocate for that. Cocktails to go. We were determined to save restaurants. And on a national level, the IRC, the Independent Restaurant Coalition, was working to get the funds that we needed to keep restaurants open. And I think it was 100 and I can't remember exactly the number anymore. I knew it, over $100 billion, which was calculated that was going to be needed in grant money to take care of restaurants and to make up for the losses.
Just to point out, it's not just that the restaurant owners were, in dire straits, but 2.5 million people lost their jobs. This had a ripple effect on the economy. I mean, it's when you close up a restaurant, as you've said, it affects supply chain, it affects employees, it affects a lot of different people beyond the entrepreneurs and the chefs, right?
Yeah. Well, it affects neighborhoods. It affects safety in neighborhoods when restaurants close. We saw it. I mean, Jamie Bissonnette told us about Toro. They closed Toro, and there was vandalism and crime around the restaurant that hadn't existed before. We have had workers who were not eligible for unemployment. We had to figure out a way to keep them employed. So we started making meals for hospital workers. We started a GoFundMe page to raise money so that we could make these meals and pay our staff. And then we've joined forces with Off Their Plate, which was started by a Harvard student who wanted to saw the huge gap for people who were working in hospitals and for restaurant workers. And so it was a program that actually spread across the country. She did an amazing job with that. That's what we were doing. We were not resting. I mean, I was on the third floor in my house. I couldn't leave because my husband is respiratory compromised, so I couldn't leave and go out. I couldn't go to work, but the folks in my restaurants were working, and it was a really, really hard time, and it still is. We lost staff members to COVID, and we lost staff members who had to leave town. They had to work. They went to Texas and Florida because they had to find employment. This is what COVID did to restaurants and restaurateurs. And it's not over. We're still fighting. We're still fighting for the Restaurant Revitalization Fund. We got $26.8 billion. It was not enough. We're fighting for 60 at this point. And it's, we're still on these calls. And I was on a call this morning, and it seems that 86% of the people who applied for restaurant relief funds have indicated if they don't get them, they will close for good. So it's anticipated that after New Year's Eve, we will see an enormous number of closings because the winter kills us.
So one of the calls to action for people on the phone tonight would be to visit some of these restaurants and
support restaurants, and also understand that this funding is critical. These grants are critical for the survival of restaurants.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I don't want to end on that somber note, but I do want to take a minute to open up for questions, because I think there's some people who have been putting in questions in the Q&A, and we encourage you to put in more questions. We may go back and share a couple more slides after we take some questions too. So I'm just going to do that for a minute, is open up. This is a question from somebody who says, can you tell us something about how you've approached menu development? This sounds like somebody who might be maybe a cook themselves. Menu
Sure.
development.
So I've approached menu development in many different ways. What I do like to do, and I think everybody appreciates, is putting some kind of parameters around the menu. So for instance, at Rialto, it was a regional Italian menu. So I would choose a region that I thought connected with the season. So in the summer, I might go south to Sicily because, you know, Sicily is warm, hot, and there's a lot of seafood and tomatoes and herbs and things like that. So in the summer, I might choose to focus on Sicilian food. Not 100%, but some. Seasonality always drives my menus, always drives my menus. So for instance, now at Trade, if you come to Trade, we have squash in 3 different places because Vero Farm is still delivering squash. And we have cauliflower in 2 different places because Vero Farm is still delivering cauliflower. And then I think about vegetable, seafood, and animal protein, you know, meat and chicken, or meat and poultry, and think about balancing the menu with those things. These days, there are many more vegetable-driven dishes than there would have been on my menu, say, 20 years ago. People really connect with vegetables and really love vegetable dishes. So that's what we're doing, which makes me very happy because I could eat vegetables all day and don't really need much else.
So this, related to that question that somebody asked, another question that someone sent me this afternoon is, when you're thinking about a restaurant, so choose Porto, do you conceive of that with a certain client in mind, like not specific client, like it's not Maggie Pax, but do you have like a perspective on who you think will be the people who will most want to come to that restaurant versus another one?
100%. And in fact, interesting that you chose Porto, because when we thought about Porto and when we first developed the business plan for that, we thought that our clients would be the people that shop at Saks, because it's right across the street from Saks, or right across the pathway from Saks. And it turned out that those were not our clients. So, and our menu was somewhere between what it is now and Rialto. It wasn't as fancy as Rialto, but it was a little more refined, a little more composed, a little more expensive. And people were not responding to the menu at all. And what we found was we actually were a neighborhood restaurant. And so we needed to respond to the neighborhood. And what we did was to bring people in. We had several meetings with our investors, who many of whom lived in the area in Back Bay. And also we talked to the people who lived in the neighborhood, and they said, you know, we want more salads, we want more vegetable dishes, we want more grilled fish. You know, we don't want these fancy, you know, esoteric kinds of ingredients. And so that's what we did.
Yeah, so being surprised maybe by who you find out is your clientele. We just got a question from someone named Francesco who says, I just heard a reference made to Sicilian food. I was born and raised in Sicily, so it got me super interested. Will you introduce Sicilian recipes in the Trade menu, or have you already? I don't know. The Trade menu in Sicily.
Trade is actually Greek inspired, Mediterranean. And I, you know, off the top of my head, at Porto's Italian. So we have had Sicilian inspired dishes for sure. I just, right off the top of my head, can't think of anything.
Maybe we should send him to that restaurant instead.
Yeah.
All right, now the questions are really pouring in. So someone named Meryl is asking about the impact on the Grubhubs and the impact on restaurants for Grubhub and Ubereats. I mean, on the one hand, they help people get the food. On the other hand, there's these fees, and how has that affected you?
Well, certainly during COVID, it was really beneficial to have these delivery services. They took advantage of us. Some of them were charging between 30 and 38% for
Wow.
delivery to the restaurant. So that means for every dollar that we receive, they would take between 30 and 38%. And that's why we're fighting those fees, because it's just ridiculous, you know, and the small mom and pop places, they just can't afford it. Not only that, they were using they're collecting all this data and they're not sharing it with us. And they were also doing really underhanded things with using, you know, with our menus and using us without us actually signing up, and I mean all kinds of underhanded things. So we're in the process of addressing that and working through that, and some of them are being responsive.
Yeah.
There's no doubt that delivery services are really important and helped us out during COVID, but they took advantage.
It's got to be a fair playing field. Yeah. So comment from Luana that Boston does have a number of female chefs. I mean, it's kind of amazing that we do, but in general, her point of view is that males still outnumber females in restaurant kitchens, especially maybe in the celebrity chef part of it. Were there unique challenges that you faced as a woman in the restaurant industry? And by the way, how do you set your culture so that it's not hostile, like we hear some of these workplaces can be? But her question is really about what challenges you face as a woman in the industry.
So you have to remember that I've been at this for almost 40 years. So I don't think it's amazing that I'm successful or that there are women. I think that what we can do whatever a man does. Did I have to fight, and did I have roadblocks? Absolutely, 100%. So let me just talk about the culture, because I think that's a really interesting question. What I focused on early on when I was a chef was creating a culture that was welcoming, recognizing what it was that that caused a toxic culture. And a lot of that had to do with whether or not the leader in the kitchen was taking responsibility for creating that culture. And so that's what I did, was to recognize that. And so that's what I taught to the people that worked for me. Not everybody can do that. And yeah, there are so many kitchens still where it's not a fun place to work. My daughter was working in a kitchen that was a horrible place to work. It was led by a woman. It was not a man, it was a woman. Creating a positive culture means being able to be self-reflective and also to understand that pulling a team together successfully is the most important thing that you can do. So I currently at Trade, which is the restaurant that I'm heading up. And by the way, I'm there 24/7. And the fact that I'm not there right now is been unusual in the last 3 weeks. I took over because there were 2 chefs in the first 2 months that we opened who did not work out. And so I've gone back to be the chef working day in and day out, which I haven't done in 15 years. So I still have it. That chef 100 years ago that told me that I didn't have the stamina, I didn't know what he was talking about. And it's all about making sure that, people speak to each other respectfully, that you're organized, that you thank people, that you recognize the hard work people are doing, that you teach and you help people grow. And kitchens where that doesn't occur, it usually has to do with the fact that the person who in charge doesn't have a lot of self-confidence. They're not good teachers. They're not good mentors. They're not organized.
Yeah, makes it a
I
lot
think
harder.
the world centers around them. So
yeah. So there's more questions about menus, and let me just ask you two of them in tandem. One of them is a question about whether you have to change the menu in order to accommodate food delivery and the travel time and whatnot, you know. I heard that Domino's is getting all kinds of complaints that their pizza's arriving late and cold or whatever. But the other question, so that's one question, is about like for delivery, do you have to change it? And then the other question someone asked about was, are there any memorable menu mistakes that you will share with us tonight? Like bloopers that you thought would be great that people just hated?
yeah, I will. I promise I will share that. In terms of delivery, yes, we do think about that. You know, like at Saloniki, pre-COVID, I think it was like 30% was delivery. And during COVID, it was almost 100% delivery. So we really looked at how our food was packaged, what kind of packaging we used, what kinds of dishes there were certain things that just weren't going to travel.
Yeah.
So yes, that's a very good question, and people do think about that a lot. There's some people who won't do to go because they just don't know what's going to happen at the other end, and food suffers. I mean, you know, if you make something and then you take it to work for lunch, it's going to be very different 4 hours later. So yeah, we are very much aware of that, and we, yeah. I mean, people want ice cream to go. It's the weirdest thing.
Dry martini to go.
So we say you're going to have creme anglaise. And that, as far as a blooper, yeah. In fact, I was just talking about this today because I was interviewing somebody for a position, and I asked the chef the same question. I once thought it would be a really good idea. This is early on in the Rialto days, when I was doing all kinds of sort of experimental kinds of things, and people most of the time were buying it and were intrigued by it. But this was, and you're going to be horrified. Everybody's going to be horrified. It was a seaweed gelatin with squid ink. So it would be like a layer of gelatin on a plate, and on it would be scallop crudo with something on it. I can't remember. It was disgusting. It was so awful. And I kept pushing to sell it. And the servers would say, Chef Jody, they really don't like this. I finally took it off the menu. But I think it was on there for about a week. I think I pushed it for a week, and then I finally realized, wait a minute.
Well, so on the flip side, Francesco's back to say that he's going to share his eggplant parmesan recipe from his grandmother in Sicily. So
nice.
Be looking for that.
I want to just tell Francesco something. So is Francisco or Francesco?
Francesco.
Francesco, right. Wrong language. I did a bike trip in Sicily, and I was cooking in a restaurant where the chef was a woman, and she was the son of the owner. I mean, she was the mother of the owner. And it was her kitchen, and he had invited us to come and take over the kitchen and cook, this group of people. And she really wasn't not happy about that. We could tell. And she was watching us the whole time. And she wanted to know, we went to the market, bought all this fish, and she wanted to know what I was going to do with the fish. And I told her, and she nodded. And when I said, and then I'm going to add some basil, she said, you can't do that. And I said, I can't. She said, no, it has to be parsley. You cannot serve, you cannot cook basil, with this. I don't even remember what it was. And I said, okay. And it was parsley. It was parsley. I did what I was told.
Very good. Very good. Now we have Francesca asking a question. She wants to know kind of about sourcing. And she wants to know if you have a person for each restaurant who goes out, one day of the week or every day of the week to get certain vegetables and meat and fish, or is it a different kind of sourcing that you use in this day and age?
It is a different kind of sourcing. We do it the other way. We build relationships with our vendors. And so, for instance, at Trade and Saloniki, we have a relationship with a woman named Alexia, who has a company called Olympiana. And so we get our olives and our cheese. And if we want something in particular, our olive oil, we speak directly with her, and the delivery comes the next day. With vegetables during farming season, we buy directly from the farm. And we buy from fish companies that we trust and we have relationships with. The same is true with meat companies. There's a young man who is growing microgreens. I just met with him this morning. His name is Oliver. Boston Microgreens. They're these beautiful little microgreens. We had a meeting. He's going to bring me some samples. So they come to us. We don't go to them, except during farmers market season. Oftentimes we'll go once or twice a week to the farmers market and actually purchase, tomatoes and peppers and all the beautiful vegetables in the summer and the fall, spring, summer, and fall, directly from the farmers market.
Great. Someone named Radha is asking a question about how you can come up with the names for your restaurants. You open a bottle of wine and sit down with your husband and brainstorm. Is there a, some other process that you use to come up with these names?
It's naming restaurants is really, really hard. It's a really hard process. And with partners in particular, if you have partners, and I have partners in my restaurants. So it's a lot of back and forth. It's a lot of experimentation, like trying things out. It's vetting with friends and family. It's, thinking about what does it mean, this word mean today? What's it going to mean tomorrow? So Porto, for instance, we chose the name Porto because we wanted to evoke a port, a Mediterranean port.
Yep.
Because the food was going to be, the original idea was the food was going to be of the sea, lots of fish, so port. But Porto, of course, there's a place called Porto, so people think that it's a Portuguese restaurant sometimes. So there's a miss there. Trade, we had such a hard time coming up with a name for Trade because the original Trade 10 years ago, the menu was of travel. We wanted to I had been locked into Italian food at Rialto. We really just wanted to broaden the whole scope of the menu. And so we chose trade indicating exchange of ideas. We were in the financial district where exchange happened in terms of finances. It was also Atlantic Wharf where there was exchange from actual the market, and trade of goods. So we thought that was a great name, but I don't think anybody really gets it, right? Saloniki is a diminutive for Thessaloniki, which is where Eric Papachristos, my business partner, comes from, and the inspiration, for Greece. So, but yeah, it's hard. Naming restaurants is really, really hard because there's the initial, what does that word mean? And so what, how are you going to tell people what it means? Eventually, it just is its own thing. So when people think of Trade at the corner of Atlantic and Congress, they think about a restaurant.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I know we're coming up short on time. Can we keep you a few minutes after?
Sure. Whoops.
Sounds like the restaurant is calling. So, we're all very fussy eaters these days, right? We have things we won't eat, things we're allergic to, all kinds of objections. How is this a real pain in the neck for restaurants, or have you guys accommodated and it's become just another part of running business, or is it really hard to accommodate for all these dietary restrictions that we have?
Sorry, they're trying to find flour in the restaurant, and I said, yes, this is the flour. Yes, that's the one. Sorry about that.
No problem.
You know, we've been dealing with dietary restrictions from the beginning. You know, people have real concerns. There was the time when nobody was eating sugar. There was the time when nobody was eating fat. There was, you know, where people wanted things that were fat-free and then ordered the you know, richest, most decadent chocolate dessert. We're in the business of making food for people so that they're happy. And we've always been accommodating, you know. The gluten one was a problem. I mean, it really sort of shone the light on the difference between sensitivity or dislike and an allergy, because celiac is a real thing and it's a real allergy and it's a really scary one, and which is something that we learned, you know, years ago. Nobody knew about celiac. You know, in the last 10 years, we've learned a whole lot. And what we've learned is that we want to make sure that there's, you know, isn't cross-contamination and that we're not going to make somebody sick. So if somebody tells us that they're allergic to something and they're not really allergic, they just don't like it, and we jump through all of these hoops, like, you know, it's new pants, it's new gloves, it's changing, you know, making sure it's coming out of a different station. That's what we do for an allergy. If it's a sensitivity, or I just don't really like it, but it's easier if I just tell you that I have an allergy, just know that we're jumping through hoops to ensure that we don't cause somebody a health issue or serious health issue.
So a good point to know, just from the expense point of view, like if you just don't prefer something, it's one thing versus, yeah, I can see how that would make a difference to the restaurant for sure.
Yeah.
So there's probably more questions than we can get to, but there is one I want to kind of end on, which is, it's a Monday night, you're not at a restaurant for some reason, you are home. What do you cook for yourself?
Pasta usually. I love pasta. You know, I could eat pasta 7 days a week. I don't, but I could. As we get into the, you know, it's getting a little bit colder, braises. I love, you know, braised meats. I love a really good roast chicken. Simple food is what we have at home. I mean, sometimes, like my children are going to come home this weekend. We'll probably make the four of us will make some wild blowout dinner. You should show the picture of me dancing with my children.
I am going to.
When they're here, we put on music and yeah. So that's my husband, Ken. We're on a bike trip in the south of France. This is my that's me with my children cooking in the kitchen and dancing. We always dance. And then that's a picture of our PMC team the first year.
That's wonderful.
So we've been riding, I think, 11 years at this point. So yeah, so it's usually pretty simple food unless the kids are here, and then it, you know, who knows? Yeah.
So I do want to give a quick shout out for Share Our Strength, one of the nonprofits that you mentioned, and just the good work they do. So if people feel moved to donate to Share Our Strength or to go to a restaurant or both, they can really make a difference for children and for restaurants as well.
Yeah, right now, this year has been, it's not just Share Our Strength, the greater, or if you want to contribute locally, the Greater Boston Food Bank. And then if you're concerned internationally, Partners in Health is dealing, they're looking for money right now, or they're requesting money for a PPE for people around the world. You know, Haiti's in terrible shape. So yeah, there are plenty of places. These three organizations certainly would really appreciate any help.
So the Greater Boston Food Bank here in Boston, Share Our Strength nationally, and Partners in Health on a global, international basis. Yeah, that's great.
Yeah. So
terrific.
And my call to action, would you like a call to action?
We'd love it.
Come see me at, I hope you all come to one of my restaurants and let me know when you're coming. I'm at Trade 24/7 these days. But would love to see you and make you some meatballs.
I think you're going to hear from some people who have been on this call. So Jody, I just want to thank you for a really informative, interesting talk tonight. I know that it's been great for all of the people on the Zoom to have a chance to hear from you directly and just hear some of your stories from the kitchen. So thank you very much.
Oh, you're welcome.
All right. Good night.
Good night, all.
Bye-bye.
Again, Maggie and Jody.